An absolutely huge Warhammer 40K rules update today. Games Workshop's hitting the balance hammer pretty hard with towering units, artillery, and Aeldari in particular, plus a few other important changes for the game. Let's talk about the nerfs and rules changes and how it's going to affect each faction. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the big Warhammer 40k balance pass, this one being the initial one after the 10th edition rules drop. Basically Games Workshop trying to fix at least a few of the glaring things that are pretty much dominating tournament tables at the moment, and the main game of this one seems to be to make sure that towering models aren't just blasting enemy armies straight off the table. The same goes for Ignore's line of sight artillery, and trying to rein in the rampant power of Aeldari, who won something like 9 out of 11 grand tournaments last weekend. This first balance pass change has mainly been made with tweaks to the Minotaur and Field Manual. Looks like they're mainly going with points cost changes to do game balance this time round, rather than creating sweeping changes to the game rules, which I think might be one of the ways to go, as it makes them be a little bit more fine-tuned in terms of what things they nerf and what things they don't. I certainly wouldn't agree with every single change that they'd made here, but I feel like if they'd just been making flat-out changes to the towering rule or indirect fire rules, for example, they probably would have hit a lot more units that really didn't need to be. As mentioned, the problems that they're trying to address seem to be towering units which have lots of firepower. On a lot of terrain, it means that they can just basically delete lots of armies off the board turn 1, particularly if terrain's a little bit on the light side in 10th. Artillery is kind of the same. It looks like indirect fire is just a bit too strong over quite a lot of armies in 40k, perhaps particularly with the Space Marines, but I'd say Imperial Guard as well can be a bit of a depressing list to play against when they're just full on artillery spam. Though admittedly that's partly because Games Workshop haven't really made a few of their other options like the Lehman Russ tanks particularly strong. Finally, I feel like there's not too much debate that Aeldari are a bit overpowered in 10th edition. Loads of great rules in their index, lots of powerful units, awesome movement shenanigans, though perhaps the single biggest problem tended to be just plugging in loads of fate dice for loads of automatic mortal wounds in their shooting phase, which has been reined in at least a little bit. In this update, the broad changes are they've increased cost for towering units, increased points cost for indirect fire units, though not all of them. They've hit a few other units with choice nerfs, such as Tyrannid's Biovores and Eldar Fire Prisms, and also made a couple of small housekeeping updates for Plague Marines and Black Templar Sword Brethren. The only major rules change that they've done is that Aeldari Fate Dice change, which we'll talk about first. And in terms of future balance passes, they did also clarify things as well. They said that the index error errata will happen towards the end of July. That's all of the typos and rules that don't quite work with the indexes, of which there are quite a lot. And the next proper Warhammer 40k balance pass will be more likely to happen in autumn. So it sounds like this is the last major balance adjustment for a while, unless they find something absolutely truly busted that they failed to anticipate, maybe out of the Space Marines or Tyrannid codexes. Let's get into the changes themselves though, and we'll start out with the Aeldari, certainly 40k's strongest faction at the moment by any tournament metrics whatsoever. Crazily busted win rates around the 70% sort of mark, and as mentioned seems to be winning the vast majority of grand tournaments over the past week or two, very much living up to the expectations that people had for them. Eldar have got loads and loads of things going for them, so it's perhaps not surprising that Games Workshop decided to step in at least somewhat early, though I do think that after these changes they're still going to be one of the strongest factions in the game. The big change for Eldar is that now Fate Dice can only be used once per phase. Fate Dice are the automatic pool of dice that Eldar get, and then you get to substitute in certain values into key rolls, say for example the classic one of plugging a 6 into a devastating wounds roll with something like a support weapon or a Wraith Knight, and then that hit becomes automatic mortal wounds, flat out deleting a lot of enemy squads. Locking the Fate Dice to only being used once per phase will definitely be a big nerf to Eldar just plugging in absolutely tons of damage in the first couple of shooting phases and then burning through most of their Fate Dice pool. It means that you're only going to get one auto 6 to wound in the shooting phase each time, probably being done by the Farseer, so you don't even have to burn through a native 6. You could save them for other powerful rolls like say charge rolls to almost guarantee a unit gets into combat, or potentially things like Overwatch rolls. Getting an auto hit with say a heavy Wraith Cannon in Overwatch could be pretty brutal. It is kind of interesting that they didn't actually break the auto 6s and devastating mortal wounds combo. I was expecting that if they went after anything then that might have been one of the best things to go for. That is the bit that they went for when the Deathwatch had that kind of broken stratagem with anti-infantry 2+ triggering mortal wounds, potentially hoovering out over 100 mortal wounds against infantry armies from a few squads in a single round of shooting. Obviously far above what the Eldar are able to do with it, but still that does seem to be one of the things that is the most obnoxious. Instead they seem to have gone the route of increasing the points cost of a few key units, Particularly the Wraith Knight and the support weapons were the ones that you can plug automatic 6s in for big mortal wounds. Not really sure if that's the ideal fix, as it means that the other weapons of the Wraith Knight and the support weapons are paying the price tag for that ability. Does mean that they might be a bit more skewed towards just using them if you can use that automatic 6 and not using them if not. Those D-cannon support weapons went up to 105 points from 85, a plus 20 increase, and the Wraith Knight got an enormous plus 105 point increase, going all the way up from 370 to 475. To be honest, they still might well be playable at that points cost if gaming to the absolute maximum with the automatic 6s and the -1 to wound and everything. They're still very, very scary, but that's definitely a big increase, and they're no longer anywhere near as auto-include as they were before. The Wraith Knight I think has been hit by a bit of a double nerf with this, is that interaction plus the fact that it's towering, as a whole load of towering things have gone up as well. Otherwise, the Night Spinner has caught a plus 30 point nerf due to being artillery. Most artillery things in the game went up as well that were already strong. The Fire Prism went up 25 points from 125 to 150. At 125 they were just ludicrously efficient with their full rerolls to hit and wound. I think still at 150 they're still going to be absolutely solid. You can still do some pretty nasty shenanigans with them, say exposing one of them, having two of them fire through that, and then fire and phase to keep the other one hidden. Finally, the Skavik Wraith Knight, that also goes up 55 points, though I'd say it probably wasn't the problem one really. Seeing as it's still just a little bit cheaper than the regular one, I suspect that the regular one's going to get taken a lot more. Overall, despite some really quite powerful choice nerfs to some of their best units, I still think that Aeldari are going to be absolutely fine. The Fate Dice mechanic's still really powerful, and it just means that you'll be spending more dice in other phases with things like charges or passing in vulnerable saves, and you're still going to get at least a decent amount converted into powerful shooting. The big built-in reroll still means that their anti-tank fire is still great, and their stratagems give you some awesome movement shenanigans, particularly Phantasm. Feel like they're still probably on for being one of the strongest factions in the game. I guess we'll see if it's enough to allow the other top armies to catch up a little. Otherwise, before we talk towering and artillery, I thought we'd just go through the other small points changes. First up, Tyranids have had a nerf to the Biovore. This one's gone up from 40 points to 65 points per model. Really quite a massive nerf percentage-wise there. And it's kind of punishing for their actual direct damage with the Strength 6 damage 2 and the mortal wounds. I think this one again is maybe a bit of a combination nerf, as it's not just that was kind of an issue for them, it was the fact that they'd throw out a bunch of spore mines into the midfield, slow down an entire enemy's advance into the midfield objectives, and potentially have game-wide consequences. The spore mines could weirdly also be very useful for tactical objectives as well, which I guess they still certainly can be. You can throw them into the backfield for things like behind enemy lines and similar. I would have rated them absolutely top tier, borderline auto-include for Tyranids before, maybe slipping down just a little bit on that. I still do feel like 1 or 2 though, to have that kind of utility is still pretty massive. Certainly could be still worth it, but seems far worse for the actual damage output. Barbagaunt still seems to be fine, they're still going to be up to their slowing infantry shenanigans, but weirdly enough they also nerfed the Harpy as well, I guess also for probably spawning the spore mines perhaps. A bit of a perplexing one that it went up quite so hard this one. I feel like the Harpy was a long way from being a problem unit. I would have considered it somewhat weak for Tyranids before this. Otherwise, for points changes, we've got a small change to the Primaris Sword Brethren. This one was Games Workshop fixing a typo basically. Previously they were listed as 150 or 330 for 10. Most things are double the smaller number if you want to take double the amount of them, but these guys for some reason had a disparity. They basically confirmed that they're now 165 for 5 or 330 for 10, so they are going for the higher points cost there. Technically a bit of a nerf if you did want to run a small unit of them. Basically they have confirmed that the higher points cost was the correct one. Finally, for small points changes that don't really fit into either towering or artillery, we've also got a Plague Marine unit size change. This was perhaps one of the single biggest units that drew them criticism with their new points cost system. In new 40k you have to field units as per 5 or 10s normally, due to that normally being the way that they're packaged in the box. Plague Marines look like they've just been skimmed over with that, as they come in boxes of 7, not 5 or 10, but it seems that they've missed to give them a 7 model points cost. Now they have updated the official rules for them, and they can be fielded in a mid-sized squad, something that most other squads in 40k can't be. You can field them as 7 models for 140 points should you wish to, and field them in units of Nurgle's holy number. Still probably makes more sense to do one or the other tactically, seeing as you get the extra equipment in units of 5 or 10, but this one did just seem like an oversight to me, though I'm not really too surprised that they changed it. Next up though, the two other major themes to the changes are big nerfs to towering units with heavy firepower, plus points increases targeted to most of the fairly good indirect fire units in the game. I'm glad that this time round they didn't decide to do something weird with actually changing the indirect fire rule. They've already got a system for it, where it's -1 to hits, and also grants the enemy cover if you fire out of line of sight. I think that was kind of sensible. Whichever system you have, you can still have either undercosted or overcosted indirect fire weapons, so a bit better that they went in with a slightly more surgical approach and tried to tailor the nerfs to the indirect fire units that might have been causing problems. In general, I think it is one of the most important areas to keep an eye on for balance in Warhammer 40k, as if you have any unit that can just reliably deal some serious damage out of line of sight, people are just going to take lots of copies of it. It means that the opponent just doesn't really have much counterplay to their units being removed from the board. They can't hide things behind terrain, so it means that damage that is allowed to fire this freely should come at a decent premium compared with the rest. Perhaps Space Marines were one of the single most obvious examples of this, particularly the Primaris Desolation squad. These guys were just ludicrously undercosted at 125 points, voted as one of the very top units in the game by that strongest 10 units in 40k poll we did a week or so back. The Castellan launchers and the Vengor launcher can kick out surprising amounts of firepower if you give them bolted discipline, an extra AP-1 with a stratagem, and potentially also the full rerolls of Oath of Moment, just destroying a lot of troops straight off the board out of line of sight, and also then potentially stepping up to use their super crack rockets, which are pretty solid anti-tank as well. Now they're up to 170 points, up from 125, which seems far more in line with their abilities. I feel like they'll still be usable at that points level, particularly when built around as before with the bolter discipline. You can still have a very scary squad of 10 supported Desolation Marines, blasting off key enemy units off the board, but it will cost you a whole load more in terms of points, so you will be left with a few less bodies to man the battle line with. The Whirlwind has also seen a kind of similar change, going up to 150 from 125, nowhere near quite as bad a nerf for that one. Again, this had some pretty serious indirect firepower with Strength 8, AP2 and Damage 2, a bit better at cracking slightly tougher stuff that the Desolation Squad Castellan missiles might have struggled against. Doesn't look like there was any increase for the Thunderfire cannon, which definitely felt like the least exciting of the Space Marines artillery, even if it could hand out the -2 movement thing. Overall, they seem like pretty reasonable points adjustments here, still very usable for the Space Marines, but no longer as crazy auto-include as they were before. Perhaps the biggest nerf though falls to the army that's got lots of artillery. Several guard tournament lists were just absolutely spamming basilisks and manticores and various other artillery contraptions. They just really weren't particularly well balanced versus direct damage Leman Rosses, having very similar damage outputs despite the ability to fire out of line of sight, and could get even stronger with sentinels marking targets for them. Some of the biggest nerfs fall to the basilisk and the manticore, basilisk going up to 135 from 110, the manticore to 125 from 105. They were perhaps two of the scariest defenders. The Manticore is just quite good general purpose damage output with damage 3 and rerolling hits against units with 5 or more models, and the Basilisk had strength 8 and damage 2 damage output and also slowed down a unit as well. They still seem perfectly playable at those new points costs, particularly with Sentinels marking the targets for them, maybe even focusing fire with that AP-1 stratagem. Otherwise, the Wyvern and the Death Strike both went up a little bit, the Wyvern to 110 from 90, the Death Strike to 160 from 135. I feel like maybe they weren't quite as exciting compared with the first two. The Wyvern maybe being okay, the Death Strike just not really functioning in the same sort of way, so I'm not sure it really needed the nerf. I didn't really see many lists taking one. That one feels kind of bad now. The Field Ordnance Battery with the Bombast Field Guns, that's up to 120 from 100. That's kind of unfortunate for the other weapons like the heavy las cannons and things. They're basically paying the price for having one of the weapons be a barrage weapon. That's perhaps one unfortunate example of Games Workshop's point system not differentiating between war gear. For the Forge World units, the Medusa and Earthshaker cannons are up a little bit, 80 points each now rather than 65 and 70. I feel like they've actually come through fairly well, particularly the Earthshaker platform. Only going up from 70 to 80 still looks very, very efficient, particularly with the Basilisk going up far more. Even having massively less mobility, those things still look very efficient for the points cost now. Otherwise, the Praetor's up to 275 and the Colossus up to 160 as well. Heavy weapon squad mortars are still untouched, so they didn't get any worse despite having indirect fire, but I feel like they were less exciting than a bunch of the other choices. Overall, for the Guard, it's definitely not that good news. Even with access to all this crazy artillery, I still probably would have ranked them at least kind of mid-tier, and having the most powerful element of their army go up massively in points cost is a bit annoying for them. I think in reality this probably gets the artillery kind of near to where it needs to be. Still very strong overall, but Guard could do with a bit of help, particularly with things like the Leman Russ battle tanks and tanks in general. They just feel a bit on the overcosted side compared with things that other factions can get. Otherwise, for artillery, most other things were untouched. We already mentioned the Night Spinner for the Aeldari and the support weapons, which went up a bit. The only two other major artillery focus changes, though, were the Sisters of Battle Exorcist going up to 170 from 140, and the Grey Knight's Purgation Squad going up to 190 or 320 from 165 or 275. For the Exorcist, I can kinda see why they'd make the change. It was a very scary generalist artillery piece, maybe kind of on par with the Whirlwind for points efficiency, so perhaps not too surprising that it gets caught in an artillery nerf. Just feels a bit sad in the context of Sisters, an army that's struggling somewhat at the moment. Again, I'd hope that in future balance updates, Games Workshop might improve a few of their more traditionally strong units from 9th edition. Some of their elite infantry is looking a bit on the lackluster side. The Purgation Squad, though, I think this is kind of brutal for the Grey Knights. A big points nerf to a unit that was kind of okay but not excessive. Again, this one really punishes other things like the Incinerators, which might be one of the stronger options for them. And perhaps a bit weird that the extra bodies in the squads now cost more than they did before, going up to 130 for the extra 5 rather than 110. I feel like these probably aren't looking particularly exciting for Grey Knights. While the Grey Knights one might be a bit questionable, I do feel like not changing artillery units just flat out is probably good. A bunch of things that didn't really need to go up also didn't go up. Things like the Rush Truck Squig Buggy for the Orcs, or the Belleros Energy Cannon, Scorpius Doom Rider, or the Plague Burst Crawler for the Death Guard. All of those were untouched, so it is sensible that Games Workshop didn't just do a blanket ban and nerf everything. Overall, I'd say there's far more positive changes than there are negative here. Particularly Desolation Marines, Whirlwinds, and some of the Eldar fire support was sensible to go up for the artillery. I think the Guard artillery changes are reasonable, though I'd be far more positive about them if they brought down the cost of some tanks at the same time. Otherwise, the other very big change they've done in this update was to towering unit firepower. The main issue being what happens if you get a whole bunch of Imperial Knights with some massive guns, line them up for some enormous shooting turn 1, and then if there isn't enough physical line of sight blocking terrain, just obliterate a whole ton of enemy units right off the board straight away. The towering keyword means that both big knights and enemy units can both see each other and be seen when they're firing across line of sight blocking terrain, things like ruins that would normally obscure them due to their special rule. I feel like it is kind of nice to have parity, that you don't just have a case of the knights being able to be shot but not shoot back, but as I explored in a previous video, the big problem with this comes with certain types of terrain that people have in their collections, say for example ruins that have a lot of windows. If the majority of the board is made up of those, it means that against a towering knight army, then basically neither army is going to be able to hide any units from each other whatsoever. And it just means there could be a vast power disparity compared with playing knights on a table like this, versus playing knights on a table where everything is filled in and you just have solid ruin walls. In the one case, the knights can see and shoot basically everything and probably just win the game very easily. In the other case, they'll probably not be able to see very much at all and be vastly weaker as a result. I wouldn't be too surprised if tournaments tend to either use filled in ruins as a result of that, or maybe do some sort of house ruling to counter such. In any case, with the towering units, Games Workshop appears to have wanted to address it with points increases to the towering things with big guns. It's definitely one way to do it, provided the towering models aren't overly excessively powerful points-wise. Then having them be able to shoot you actually isn't the biggest deal in the world. It wasn't exactly an issue for things like the Orc Morkanaut or Stomper, for example, neither of which were considered very strong. The changes that they made are broadly to the towering units with actual good firepower. Most of the dedicated melee ones didn't go up. A few of the more firepower focused ones didn't go up either. Things like the Necron Monolith escaped a nerf, though I still think that they did hit a few things that didn't need to with nerfs. And for the most part, towering melee things where it's more of a disadvantage to them didn't tend to get toned down. Say for example, the Knight Gallant and the Chaos Knight Rampager, they stayed at the same points cost. First up, we've got the changes for the Imperial Knights, definitely one of the very strongest factions in Warhammer 40K prior to this, so really not too surprising that they went up, and by quite a bit. The changes mainly affected the Knights, just as they're the armies that have got a whole ton of walkers with a towering keyword and big guns. And it seems that all the units that fill that criteria went up by around about 14 or 15% in terms of a points increase. A lot of the Questorus Knights are now around about 450 points. The Castellan and Valiant are up to 565. And the Acastus Knights also went up proportionally. They cost the most, but they both went up a big 100 points with their enormous anti-tank damage. The Armigers didn't get any nerfs, nor did the Gallant, as they neither had towering nor big guns. And the single biggest loser out of all of these was Canis Rex, who it looks like they decided to treat as a slightly special case. His datasheet was generally considered pretty undercosted comparatively, and he's jumped all the way from 405 to 490. Overall, it's definitely a solid nerf to Imperial Knights as an army overall. Maybe not too surprising given just the sheer amount of raw power they could unleash. Big rerolls and feel no pains on the defensive, plus some very powerful stratagems indeed. I feel like the changes might be kind of sensible to have them become a little bit more of a mid-tier or upper mid-tier army, as opposed to truly enormously stand out. I feel like as a result, probably Knight armies are going to skew a fair bit more towards armigers. They were already very solid and in good competition before with the big knights, but now even more so. And previously I think the Gallant was overshadowed, but now much less so. I did also notice that the Cerastus Knight Lancer went up a decent amount of points as well, despite not really having big guns. That one again was looking kind of monstrously strong with a 4+ invulnerable save as well as huge melee and faster movement. Still looks like it'll probably be remaining playable despite the points increase. For the Chaos Knights, they've pretty much had very similar points cost increases here. While I can see Games Workshop probably wanting to try and keep things parallel between the two, I think in reality the Chaos Knights just didn't really have the same sort of raw shooting power as the Imperials for the most part, and I think that Games Workshop definitely could have afforded to go a lot less high on the points cost increases compared with the Imperial Knights here. Maybe they should have had a bit more of a mid-ground, increasing them by more like 30 or 40 points rather than 50 or 60. In general though, most things are pretty parallel. The Rampager is the only towering knight that escaped a points increase. I feel like they probably could have gone a bit lighter on the Abominant, seeing as it wasn't considered particularly strong before. It's definitely skewed towards combat due to that Volkite gun. And I just can't help but think with these points changes, it's going to push Chaos Knights right back into spamming War Dogs like they were in 9th edition. Lots of their datasheets are also very powerful for that, particularly perhaps the War Dog Brigand with the 2+ shooting and extra AP, a very powerful general purpose knight to have in a swarm. Otherwise, as we mentioned, Games Workshop had nerfed the Wraith Knight quite significantly. That went up 100 points, but they also nerfed a few other towering things with somewhat big guns in the game. So I think in all honesty, probably none of these were really needed. I'm not sure if Tau or Chaos could have gone for some sort of curveball list, spamming Storm Surges or Lords of Skulls or something, but certainly the Orcs getting a nerf to the Morkanaut seems absolutely silly. That was generally considered to be a fairly weak unit at 305 points, never mind going up to 350, was already probably worse than the Gorkanaut, which seems to have kept the same points cost. The Gorkanaut's now definitely the one to go for out of the two. Otherwise though, there's a weird disparity between the Chaos Space Marines and the World Eaters called Lord of Skulls. The World Eaters one went up to 525 versus the Chaos Space Marine 480. They were both even points cost before. I don't think that the abilities or faction buffs are so enormously different that they needed to have a different points cost. Not sure what the idea behind that is. Maybe it was just a typo or an oversight. Otherwise, the Tau got their super suits nerfed, the Storm Surge went up to 465 from 405, again probably not really a unit that was causing any major problems. There was perhaps a bit more excitement around the Tau Nar Supremacy armor with its fairly enormous gun stats. That one's now going to take up a very sizable chunk of army if you do choose to run one, 790 points rather than 685, again quite a big nerf there. And finally the Necron Seraptech Heavy Construct as well, that went up to 540 points, up from 470. I suppose again that was a big Forge Worldy thing with a whole load of very powerful guns. Probably lost a lot of ground against the Monolith and the Vaults, which managed to get away unscathed. Overall, not really sure that these were quite as necessary. Seems like it isn't a particularly good day to be a towering super heavy though for Games Workshop. A lot of the standard Imperial Knights have maybe been brought a bit more in line with other things in the game, but besides the Imperial Knights, most of the towering things are probably paying higher points than they really should be. Overall, when taken as a whole though, I think broadly it's been a good thing for 40k game balance. They certainly seem to have addressed at least a few of the very most powerful armies in the game with some sizable nerfs. Eldar getting hit by some major points hits, plus the fate dice changed, Imperial Knights, which were kind of oppressive, having big points increases, and Space Marine Desolation Squad spam and Whirlwinds, having to pay a bit more of a premium if you want that enormous Oath of Moment firepower to delete some units off the board. I'd say perhaps the other two biggest losers are Chaos Knights and Astra Militarum. While I can see Games Workshop don't really want entire armies to just win the game via the towering keyword or just via indirect firepower alone, it does seem a little bit unfortunate for those that they were kind of mid-tier already and now they're much less so. I feel the Guard are still going to be using a fairly hefty amount of artillery just due to lack of other options. The Chaos Knights, I imagine, will be falling back pretty heavily on War Dog spam, which I think isn't what most Chaos Knight collectors would really want to do. As mentioned, I think that Aeldari got hit very hard, but I still expect them to be likely one of the strongest armies in the game, if not still the strongest. I think they've got a lot of other options to fall back on, and they can still do some pretty nasty fate dice damage. And otherwise, I suppose some of the other bigger winners are armies that escaped any sort of nerfs but were already pretty strong. Things like Genestealer cults with their enormous respawning shenanigans, Custodies with their big melee might, and Thousand Sons with their massive psychic damage combos. It'll be interesting to see how all this plays out in practice though. Will definitely be fun to see some tournament data when the changes filter through. Let me know what you think of the changes though. Are these good or bad for the game? And what do you make of the individual points costs? Let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and rules updates, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.